The wrong door of the morning began with a quiet unease. The kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, but a strange heaviness. Sundar sat in the back seat of the black sedan that rolled slowly past the steel and glass towers of downtown San Francisco. His fingers nervously played with the hem of his sleeve, something he hadn't done since his college days. Today was important, not because it was another meeting, but because it was the meeting. The one where everything could change. The one that could define how the board saw him, not as a manager, not as a programmer, not even as a team leader, but as a potential CEO. He'd stayed up half the night reviewing notes, preparing answers for difficult questions, and rehearsing his vision for the future of Google. It wasn't just about software or market share. For Sundar, it was about people, about building tools that lifted lives, that gave every child with a phone in their hand a chance to learn, grow, and hope. He believed that technology was not power, it was possibility. And he was ready to say that loud and clear, but he didn't expect what was about to happen as the car slowed near the entrance. A soft drizzle began to fall. His driver, an older gentleman with a kind face, turned and said, "Good luck, sir." Sundar gave a quiet smile and nodded, stepping out into the rain. He didn't mind the weather. In fact, he liked it. It reminded him of his childhood in Chennai. The monsoon rains clattering against the tin roofs, the smell of wet earth and jasmine in the air. Back then, he used to run barefoot into the rain without a care in the world. Now, every step was measured, every move calculated. But just as he walked toward the revolving doors of the building, something unusual happened. One of the security guards, a large man with sharp eyes and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, stepped forward and blocked his path. "Maintenance entrance is around the back," the guard said, without a second glance. Sundar blinked, confused. "Sorry?" The guard looked him up and down. Sundar was wearing a plain gray jacket over a white shirt, dark slacks, and scuffed shoes. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive. He didn't believe in showing off. He believed in showing up. "Janitorial staff use the back door," the guard repeated. A little louder this time. Like Sundar was hard of hearing. There was a long silence. Sundar opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind raced. He could explain. He could protest. He could pull out his badge, his phone, even his driver. But instead, he simply looked at the man and something strange happened. Instead of feeling angry or embarrassed, he felt small. Not because of what the man had said, but because of how easily he had believed it. "All right," Sundar said quietly. "Thank you." He turned and walked around the building, heart pounding, head down. The drizzle turned to rain. He didn't run. For cover. He didn't wipe the water from his face. He just walked slowly, trying to understand why he hadn't defended himself. Why he hadn't said, "I'm Sundar Pichai, Senior Vice President of Product at Google." Why he hadn't corrected the man who had looked at him and seen someone invisible. Behind the building, near the delivery trucks, he found the service entrance. The hallway inside was narrow, dimly lit, with the smell of coffee grounds and disinfectant in the air. A janitor in a green uniform pushed a cart past him and gave a polite nod. Sundar nodded back, his throat tight. He didn't feel better. He felt exposed. When he finally reached the lobby from the back corridor, he tried to shake it off. A deep breath, a quick brush of his sleeve, and he stepped out into the bright marble floor. The receptionist, a young woman with bright eyes and too much perfume, looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Pichai. Conference room 3 is just down the hall," she said, pointing with a perfectly manicured finger. "Thank you," he replied, his voice calm but hollow as he walked toward the meeting room. The sound of his shoes echoed in the hallway. He passed glass offices, each one holding men and women in suits, their eyes glued to screens, their mouths moving in silent conversations. None of them noticed him. Not really. He was there, but not there. And for the first time in years, Sundar felt like an outsider again. Like the boy from India who had stood in line for hours just to use a phone. The boy who had studied under the light of a single bulb because power cuts were common. The boy who had dreamed of making something of himself not to prove anything to others, but to prove something to that boy who had once been told that dreams were only for the rich. He reached the door to conference room 3 and paused. He could hear voices inside sharp, confident, laughing. The kind of laughter that fills rooms with power. The kind of laughter that doesn't expect interruption. He raised his hand to knock Dot, then he heard it. Are we seriously considering him? One voice said. I mean, come on. The guy's brilliant. Sure, but does he have any presence? Said another. He's just quiet. Not very CEO material, you know? There was a chuckle, then silence. Sundar slowly lowered his hand. His heart sank. He had come all this way, worked all these years, only to be dismissed through a thin wall by voices that didn't even know. He was listening. He closed his eyes. He didn't want to walk in. He wanted to turn around, walk back into the rain, and never come back. Not because they didn't believe in him, but because part of him in that moment didn't believe in himself. But then he remembered something. A voice from long ago, his mother's voice. They can question your clothes. They can question your skin. They can question your accent. But never let them question your worth. He took a deep breath and knocked. The laughter stopped. A chair scraped against the floor. Come in. Someone said. Sundar reached for the handle and opened the door. His eyes calm, his heart no longer afraid. The room fell silent as he stepped inside, rainwater still dripping from his jacket. No one spoke, but they would, and what happened next shocked everyone. The silent room door clicked shut behind him with a sound louder than it should have. Then, maybe it was just in his mind, but it felt like the whole room heard it, like time itself had paused for a brief moment to witness what came next. 12 people sat around the large oval table, each of them dressed in carefully chosen suits, ties, and polished shoes that seemed to gleam under the soft yellow lights. Their eyes moved toward him, slowly, like a camera panning across the scene. It didn't expect. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet, it was thick. The kind of silence that carries judgment wrapped in politeness. Sundar walked forward without rushing. His steps were steady, deliberate, though his chest felt like it was caught in a storm. He could still feel the rainwater soaking through the back of his collar, cold against his skin. His palms were damp, not from the weather, but from the weight of the moment. He knew that some of the people in this room already doubted him. He had heard them through the door. But worse than doubt, he could see something else in their eyes, now curiosity, and something close to discomfort. Like they weren't sure what to make of the man who had just entered their space. Wet, quiet, and unexpected. Good morning, he said softly, offering a slight nod to the room. A few returned the greeting. Others just stared. The chairman, a tall man with silver hair and a voice that always sounded like it belonged on stage, motioned toward an empty chair. Mr. Pichai, please. Have a seat. He sat down, placing his notebook gently on the table. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he took a moment to observe. It wasn't about studying others for weakness. Sundar wasn't that kind of man. It was about reading the room, understanding who needed convincing, who was already on his side, and who had already closed their mind to him. The woman across from him, glasses perched on the tip of her nose, was scrolling through her phone. The man to his left was looking straight ahead, but not at Sundar past him, as if already thinking about lunch. And at the far end of the table, a younger executive in his 30s leaned forward, pen in hand, watching Sundar carefully. That was the one to pay attention to. We've reviewed your proposal, the chairman began, his voice even and controlled. It's impressive, forward-thinking. Some would say idealistic. Sundar nodded. Thank you. We'd like you to walk us through your vision. In your own words. He knew this moment would come, but somehow, after everything that had just happened, the guard, the hallway, the overheard whispers, it felt different, heavier. The usual excitement he felt when talking about his ideas was buried beneath something else now, something harder, something more personal. He cleared his throat and began. My vision is simple, he said, but the path is not. I believe Google has a responsibility far greater than being a search engine or a data company or even a technology leader. I believe our true power lies in access, in the ability to bring information, opportunity, and education to anyone, anywhere, regardless of where they are born or how much they earn. His voice was calm, but each word was chosen like it carried weight. Because it did. He wasn't trying to sound impressive. He was trying to tell the truth. When I was a child, he continued, we didn't have a phone at home. We had to walk half a mile to a public phone booth and wait in line, sometimes for hours. I still remember the first time my father brought home a television. We all sat around it, amazed that pictures could move and speak. That memory shaped me. It made me wonder, what if everyone had access to something like that? Something that opened the world to them. He paused, letting the room breathe. Today, millions of children have smartphones in their hands, but not the tools to use them for anything beyond entertainment. I want Google to change that. I want us to be the bridge between potential and possibility. A silence followed. This time, it felt different. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Asked the younger executive, leaning forward. His tone was not aggressive, but challenging, by focusing less on how much time people spend on our platforms, and more on how much value they get from that time, Sundar replied. By creating products that are lightweight, multilingual, and accessible on the weakest networks. By working with schools in rural areas. By investing in human understanding as much as artificial intelligence. There was a rustle of movement. The woman with the glasses finally looked up. A man in a navy suit began to write something in a notebook. But then another voice cut through the room. You talk about access and opportunity, said one of the older board members. But isn't that ... Idealism? How does that translate into quarterly growth? Into shareholder returns? Sundar turned toward him, not defensive, but clear-eyed. Growth is not only measured by revenue, he said. True growth is when a child in Kenya learns math on a cheap Android phone because we made the app work offline. True growth is when a mother in a village in India finds medical advice through voice search in her own language. If we build trust, if we build tools that change lives, growth will follow. Because people don't forget the company that helped them when no one else did. There was another silence, longer this time. And in that silence, Sundar saw it. Not in everyone, but in a few. A flicker of respect, a pause in judgment, a door opening, even if just slightly. And then the chairman spoke again. Thank you, Mr. Pichai. We'll take a short break. 10 minutes. We'll reconvene to discuss next steps. Everyone began to rise. Some spoke quietly among themselves. Others headed for the door. Sundar remained seated for a moment, letting the adrenaline settle. He felt like he had run a marathon without moving. And though the weight had not lifted completely, something inside him had shifted, not because he had proven anything to them, but because he had spoken with truth and that he realized was enough. As he stood to leave the room, the younger executive approached him quietly. He said, I used to wait in line for the phone too, in a tiny town outside of Lagos. Sundar looked at him, surprised. Thanks for saying what you said, the man added. Not many people do. Sundar nodded, offering a quiet smile. Thank you. He turned to walk toward the hallway. But just before he reached the door, his phone buzzed. A message. He took it out, expecting a text from his assistant or maybe his wife. But the message stopped him cold. It read, they're planning to block your promotion. Someone inside the room is working against you. His hands tightened around the phone. He looked up slowly. The hallway ahead suddenly felt longer. The room behind him darker. He had just fought to be seen. Now he would have to fight to be trusted. And the real battle had just begun. Asterisk, the shadow in the glass. The hallway felt different now. Not physically, it was still lined with glass walls and smooth white tiles. The same quiet space it had been all morning. But inside Sundar, something had changed. The message on his phone stayed lit, glowing like a warning sign. They're planning to block your promotion. Someone inside the room is working against you. 10 simple words, but they carried the weight of betrayal. He stared at the screen for a moment longer, then locked it and slipped the phone into his pocket. He didn't want to believe it. Part of him still hoped it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, or maybe a cruel joke. But another part, the part shaped by years of subtle slights, passed over opportunities, and the way people sometimes looked at him without really seeing knew better. He walked slowly toward the break area. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mixed with soft laughter and low voices. A few executives were standing near the counter, sipping from paper cups and talking in that polished, easy tone that came from years of knowing they belonged. Sundar poured himself some tea and stood quietly at the edge of the room. He didn't want to join the conversation. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the younger executive from earlier. One who had shared that memory about Lagos, standing alone, typing something on his phone. Sundar thought for a moment, then walked over. "Do you have a second?" Sundar asked, keeping his voice low. The man looked up, nodded. "Of course." They stepped away from the others into a quiet alcove near the windows. Outside, the rain had stopped and sunlight broke through the clouds in long golden streaks. "I got a message," Sundar said. "Someone inside that room doesn't want me to move forward." "I don't know who or why." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Are you sure it's true?" "No," Sundar said, "but I've learned to trust my gut. And right now it's not quiet." The man nodded slowly, his fingers tapping the side of his phone. People don't always like change, especially when it looks different, speaks softer, and doesn't fit the mold they're used to. Sundar looked at him, unsure whether that was meant to comfort or warn. "Do you know anything?" He asked. The man didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "I don't know who sent you that message, but I do know one thing. Someone in that room has a private meeting scheduled after the break with another candidate, unofficial, quiet, not on the calendar." Sundar felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. "Who?" He asked. The man hesitated. "I can't say." "Not yet, but I'll find out. I believe in what you're trying to do, Sundar. I believe it matters. And I think they're scared of that." "Scared?" "Yes. Because you don't want power for its own sake. And that kind of person is hard to control." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sundar alone near the window. The sunlight warmed his face, but he didn't feel warm. He felt exposed. The idea that someone, maybe even someone who had smiled at him across the table, was working to stop him. It made his skin prickle. He returned to the meeting room 10 minutes later. The chairs were filling again. Voices were quieter now, more focused. The mood had shifted. Everyone knew they were entering the decision stage. The chairman cleared his throat. "Let's continue." As the discussion began, Sundar didn't speak. He listened, not just to the words, but to the tone behind them, to the way people agreed, or hesitated, to the glances that passed between board members when certain topics came up. He watched for patterns, for alignment, for the soft signals of a plan being shaped behind closed thoughts. And then it happened. A voice he recognized, one of the senior board members, a man who had barely spoken during the earlier session, leaned forward and said, "Before we talk about final decisions, I'd like to bring up an alternative." There was a brief silence. "There's a candidate from the Europe division." He continued, "Strong background, aggressive strategy, already delivered substantial revenue growth. I think we owe it to ourselves to explore every option before committing." Sundar felt it like a slow wave. The shift. The pivot. A subtle redirection dressed as logic. "This is unexpected." The chairman said carefully. "That doesn't mean it's unwise," the board member replied. A few others nodded. Some looked at Sundar. Some avoided his eyes. "What's the name of the candidate?" the chairman asked. "Thomas Drexler." A pause, then a quiet buzz of reaction. Some surprise, some interest, some concern. Sundar sat still. He knew the name. Thomas. Was sharp? Yes. Efficient. Data-driven. But he also had a reputation for being ruthless. Short-term wins, aggressive cost cuts, little regard for community programs or educational outreach. His vision for Google was simple: dominate markets, increase ad revenue, and trim anything that didn't fit that path. And now he was being considered dot just like that. Sundar looked down at his notebook. He hadn't opened it all day. But now, he did. He flipped to a blank page and began to write. Not a rebuttal. Not a defense. He wrote a question. What kind of future do we want to build? His hand trembled slightly as he wrote. But he didn't stop. He didn't speak either, not yet. There would be a time to speak dot, but first, he needed to decide something for himself. Not whether he could win, but whether it was worth fighting for a place that didn't seem to want him there. And in that moment, he remembered something his father once told him late one night under the flickering light of a dying bulb. Sometimes the world won't open the door for you. Sometimes you have to build a door on. He looked up, his eyes scanned the room, and he saw it, not fear, not doubt, but the cracks, the uncertainty, the silence waiting to be filled, and he knew if he didn't speak soon, someone else would speak for him. But just as he was about to raise his hand, something unexpected happened. A member of the board stood up, a woman, older, quiet, someone who hadn't said a word all day, and she looked at Sundar. Before we decide anything, she said, her voice steady, I want to hear what Sundar thinks. Not about numbers, not about forecasts. I want to know what kind of leader he plans to be, and why he thinks we need that leader now. The room went quiet again. All eyes turned to him. His hand was still resting on his notebook, his voice. When it came, was quiet, but it carried more weight than ever before. And then he began to speak. Asterisk. The quiet answer of silence that followed her question didn't feel like a pause. It felt like a door had opened. A quiet one, yes, but behind it was space. A kind of space that Sundar had rarely been given. Not just to explain himself, but to be seen, truly seen, not as a name on a resume, not as a man with data and degrees, but as a person with a story, with values, with scars no one in that room had ever asked about. He sat still for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. Inside him, what kind of leader do you plan to be? And why now? His fingers brushed the edge of his notebook. This time he didn't look down. He looked straight ahead. I'll answer that, he said quietly, but not the way you might expect. No one interrupted. He glanced around the room, his eyes pausing on each face, not to challenge them, not to judge, but simply to connect. I was born in a small apartment in Chennai, in southern India, he began. My family lived in a 2-room home. Not 2-bedroom, 2 rooms. No refrigerator, no television, no phone, until I was in my teens. A few eyes widened slightly. Others looked down, unsure how to respond. Every day, my father would walk miles to work and come home late with grease on his hands. He worked as an electrical engineer, not in a big company, just a small job with a steady paycheck. And yet, no matter how tired he was, he would sit with me and explain how circuits worked, how radios transmitted sound, how every machine had a pattern if you looked closely enough. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. When we finally got a phone in our neighborhood, it became a community event. Families would gather at the booth and wait in line to make a call. There was something sacred about it, something fragile. People chose their words carefully because time was expensive. And I learned early on that access to information was not a given, it was a gift. He paused. No one moved. When I came to the United States for graduate school, I arrived with 2 shirts, a suitcase full of books, and a mind full of hope. I didn't speak much. I didn't fit in. But I watched. I listened, and I built. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still low, but clearer now. I don't want to be a CEO. Because I like titles. I want to lead because I believe in building things that matter. Not just products, but trust, dignity, possibility. The older man who had introduced Thomas Drexler cleared his throat, as if about to speak, but stopped. When we talk about leadership, Sundar continued, we often talk about power, about who can make the hardest decisions, who can move fast, take control, disrupt. But I believe leadership is not about taking control. It's about creating space. Space for others to grow, to rise, to be heard. He looked at the woman who had spoken up for him. Her eyes were locked on his. You asked me what kind of leader I want to be. I want to be the kind of leader who remembers what it feels like to be unseen. The kind who knows that brilliance often speaks in quiet tones. The kind who holds the door open, not just for those already inside, but for those still standing outside, wondering if they belong. A long silence followed. Not awkward, not tense, just full of something unspoken. But felt then he sat back in his chair. He didn't smile. He didn't need to dot across the table. The chairman tapped his pen softly against the wood. Thank you, Mr. Pichai, he said after a long pause. One of the other board members, a woman who had been quiet all morning, leaned forward. Sat on this board for 9 years, she said. And I've heard a lot of pitches, a lot of strategies, but that was different. Another nodded, and for a moment, Sundar felt something he hadn't expected to feel in that room. Warmth, but it didn't last long, just as the chairman prepared to speak again. The door opened, a man stepped inside. Unannounced, tall, confident. With a sharp suit and a colder smile. Sorry to interrupt, he said. Though he clearly wasn't. I was told to wait outside, but I thought it best to come in directly. Sundar didn't need an introduction. He already knew who it was, Thomas Drexler. He walked toward the table like he already belonged there. Thomas Drexler, he said, offering a hand. I was told this would be the time for my private presentation. The air in the room shifted instantly. Some board members exchanged glances. Others pretended to look at their notes. The chairman cleared his throat, surprised and unprepared. This is, highly unusual, he said carefully. I agree, Thomas replied, without missing a beat. But we live in unusual times. I thought we were exploring all options. He gave a small smile. Not arrogant, not loud. Just sharp enough to cut and then, for the first time, his eyes landed on Sundar. Mr. Pichai, he said, with a nod. I've heard a lot about you. Sundar stood slowly, calm as ever. Likewise, he replied. The chairman looked uncomfortable. We're still in the middle of deliberations, Thomas. Of course, Thomas said smoothly. I'm happy. To wait? He stepped back, took a seat near the wall, and folded his hands in his lap. But everyone in the room knew this wasn't just waiting, it was a power move, a silent statement, sometimes you don't wait to be invited. You just show up, and Sundar understood exactly what that meant. He had just poured his heart into the room, and now a different kind of man had walked in, one who didn't ask to be seen. He demanded it, as the board scrambled to decide how to proceed. Sundar sat back down, still calm on the outside, but inside, something had shifted again. He had shown them his truth, now he would have to show them his strength, because what came next would not be fair. Asterisk the choice that changed everything. Room was no longer quiet, it wasn't loud either. But something had changed since Thomas Drexler entered. The energy shifted. Eyes wandered. Attention drifted. People who had been listening to Sundar with open minds were now leaning back, arms folded, whispering beneath their breaths. Thomas hadn't even spoken yet. He didn't need to. His presence alone, sharp, confident, cold, was enough to disrupt everything Sundar had worked to build. Sundar sat still in his chair, but inside his thoughts were racing. Not with fear, but with clarity. He had spent years climbing step by quiet step through a system that didn't always welcome him. He had worked hard, earned respect, won results, but still he was now being measured beside someone who had just walked into the room uninvited, knowing that someone on the board had secretly opened the back door for him, and yet Sundar did not speak. He waited, he watched. He listened, the chairman called for a short private discussion. Sundar and Thomas were asked to step outside. They both left the room in silence, walking side by side through the hallway like two worlds that could never quite overlap. Thomas glanced at Sundar briefly, then smirked. You made a strong impression in there. He said. Sundar didn't respond. But sometimes, Thomas added, impressions fade. Outcomes matter more than ideals. Sundar looked at him calmly. Ideals are what lead to outcomes. Without them, you just chase numbers. Thomas gave a small shrug. Maybe, but numbers get you the job. They waited outside the boardroom for what felt like an hour. Sundar stood by the window, staring out at the skyline. The clouds had returned. The light was beginning to dim. Inside the room behind the glass, shadows moved, heads turned, hands gestured. He wasn't afraid of not getting the position. Not anymore. He was afraid of what it meant if this place, this room, this company he had given so much to chose the easy power over the quiet builder. Finally, the door opened. The chairman stepped out, followed by the rest of the board. Their expressions were unreadable. We'd like to continue this in private. Just with you, Mr. Pichai, the chairman said. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Really? You don't want to hear my... Not right now. The chairman interrupted firmly. Something in his voice had changed. Thomas looked mildly amused. Very well, he said. I'll wait. As he walked away, Sundar stepped back into the boardroom. The door closed behind him. The room was quiet again. Not the awkward silence of earlier, but something heavier. Something real. The chairman looked directly at him. We've spoken at length, he began. We debated. We disagreed. But in the end, we made a decision. Sundar nodded slightly, but said nothing. The role is yours, the chairman said. You've earned it. No one clapped. There were no smiles. Just a stillness that meant everything had changed. But then, chairman added something unexpected. But there's one more thing. He paused, and Sundar waited. You should know that one of the board members violated protocol by inviting another candidate into the process. We won't say who, but the decision was not unanimous. There was resistance. Sundar understood immediately. Someone had tried to stop him. Even now, after the vote, the room was still unsure, still watching, waiting to see what kind of leader. He could celebrate, he could be relieved, but instead, he spoke the truth. I don't want this position just because I outlasted someone else, he said. I want it because I believe I can serve this company in a way that makes us better. Not faster, not richer, better. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes without flinching. But if your decision is built on fear of conflict, or just to avoid embarrassment, then I'd rather walk away now. Because that's not leadership, and that's not the Google I believe in. A deep breath followed. The chairman leaned back in his chair, visibly moved. It's not, he said softly. And that's why we chose you. There was a moment brief, but powerful when Sundar felt something rise in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but peace. The kind that only comes when you've been through fire and didn't lose your shape.